Okay, so let's start. Um, okay, so start continuing on the affective factors. We are going to go on to talk about some of the other elements related to this idea of psychological and social psychological aspect in language learning. Initially, I was going to go on with the ideas, factors for the remaining slides, but before we move on, I want you guys to log on to KLMS and you'll be able to find under our week 9 two different questionnaires. One is FLCAS, which refers to Foreign Language Classroom Anxiety Scale, and the other one is WTC, Willingness to Communicate by Peter McIntyre. So try to go and download it and if you can, and download it and try to answer one of each, either one, because it might take a lot of time to do all at once. So try to log onto KLMS and also download the scales or the questionnaire and try to answer one of them. After you're done, try to talk with your neighbors about what you thought about the questionnaire, how you would be able to complement it or change it for better use, or how you think about the appropriateness and actually measuring the anxiety scale, for instance. So let's do that for about 10 minutes. And afterwards, we'll debrief about some of the questionnaires that you have found. Have you guys finished at least one of them? Okay, so why don't you just glance through the other one that you didn't do? Just glance through, just skim through the question. And afterwards, with your neighbors, just try to talk about how you would use it or how you think are the strengths and also the weaknesses of this type of questionnaire, or how it limits or what it seems to emphasize, or what it's trying to measure or successfully or not. So with your neighbors, just try to debrief about the questionnaires and we'll talk about them together. So let's talk about some of your ideas or some of your thoughts together. I really enjoyed listening to your stories and what you have experienced so far. So let's talk about them together now. So we can talk about the questionnaire, what your responses were, or what you thought of the questionnaire itself, or what you think lacked in terms of measuring the anxiety level, or if you have been able to compare it with the willingness to communicate questionnaire, you can say like what is the difference, what the difference is, or what were some of the similarities. Any thoughts are fine.
I did the foreign language class anxiety scale by 4 weeks.
For it.
But I think there are many redundant questions. So I don't think it has to have 33 questions.
Okay, I have a question though. Why do you think there are, I mean, that comment came out in a lot of groups. Why do you think there are 33 repetitive questions?
I think for checking their honesty.
Yeah, that too, right? Yes. To make sure that just by changing the wording, are you really being honest about your feelings? I was talking to that group in the back about my own experience long time ago taking I forgot even the name of the exam. Samsung Electronics, they have a test of its own. Does anyone know what that exam is called? I thought it was called STAT or SAT. Nobody knows. Anyways, it's not important. So they have their own exam. I mean, they have their own entrance exam, I would say. And the last one, the easiest one, is about your personality. So they have a bunch of questions. I think more than like 100 questions where you have to answer what you are like, what your personal traits are like. Like, for example, I get along with people very easily. I get angry pretty uh, much at everything. Like you have the answer, but then there are those really exact repetitive questions that comes back and forth because those are places where people are paying more attention to and seeing like, are you really being honest about yourself? So similar to that, when we have these types of questionnaire, there are a lot of repetitive ones to really make sure that I think it also has to do with the reliability of the test itself. And yes, this particular one, however, is measuring the anxiety level in classroom, right? And that is one of the reasons why there are a lot of questions, not a lot, but some questions related to peer, right? I think this is something that we talked about last time about how the presence of your peers might raise or lower your anxiety level. So that I think that is somewhat echoed in this questionnaire. Good. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, we also did the first one, and we thought, well, it is about foreign language, but we mostly thought about English at first. So it may affect the results because if we think about other languages like Chinese or Japanese, it might be different from English because some people are really good at English, and English is particularly, there are a lot of people who study it, so there's a wide range in English, so there can be more peer comparing and more skill diversity, I guess. So that can also affect the results, maybe.
For that purpose specifically, this type of scale is used for the foreign language learning of the students. Let's say, for example, I have a group of students who are learning Japanese and I want to measure the idea of foreign language anxiety level in Japanese, then I would specifically say that think about learning Japanese and answer the questions. So as you just mentioned, it could be tailored for particular languages that your students or the students in the class are taking. Similar to the WTC here, this one is more specific with more directions. As you can see that you imagine that you are not imagine. This particular one is designed for speaking French, I believe, right? So you can somewhat change and ask your participants to think about the target language specifically and measure those different levels. Good. Any other thoughts? Aside from the fact that it's very repetitive and redundant. Or did you get a chance to reflect on your own self? Or
But I found myself uh, answering differently to several different questions. That does it imply that I'm dishonest?
what do you mean by you answered it slightly differently?
Like,
Intentionally or?
no, I thought I try to be honest, but I answered, yeah, I don't get anxious to some of the questions, but to some other questions, I answer like, oh, I think I'm get nervous.
Yeah, I mean, the level of the anxiousness, I think last time we talked about how it depends on the situation, right? Situation or interaction, who you're talking to or the task itself, it all varies. That's why it looks like the same question is being repeated, but somehow the subtle differences put the question into different setting or different interlocutor or different purposes. So I don't think you're being dishonest here. I think we just have this idea of different level anxiety depending on those subtle differences. Yeah, good. But another thing to note is that this is the anxiety level measuring in language classrooms. So not just the general anxiety that you would be able to measure outside of the classroom, right? So that's another difference. This was not this particular slide, but foreign language anxiety scale by Elaine Horowitz was introduced in 1986, I believe. So it's like long, long time ago. But people still tried to incorporate some of those ideas when they want to measure it nowadays too. So if you want to, for example, in your future, try to understand, does the anxiety level go down as much as or as equal to in the AI learning environment versus human learning environment? You can use this type of questionnaire to measure whether it really goes down or not. But the idea of anxiety going down might not always mean that it's something that is always positive, as we mentioned, right? And the anxiety level too much, the too extreme anxiety might in fact hinder the learning process, but the moderate level of anxiety might actually help or facilitate the learning. Okay, any other comments? Okay, so let's move on with the rest of our chapter. And we're gonna go through like so we're gonna go through this idea of empathy. So empathy, in talking about empathy, we have something called transaction, which refers to a social interaction through which an individual reveals thoughts, ideas, or feelings to another person. This is the process of reaching out beyond the self to others, and language here serves as a primary tool for accomplishing this process. Two key transactional variables are empathy and extroversion. So transaction refers to the broader, very big social interaction in general. And under transaction, what it helps would be something called empathy. And the next one called extroversion when we compare it with introversion, extroversion, that extroversion. So going to first the empathy. Empathy is the ability to put oneself in another person's shoes. So reaching beyond the self to understand what another person is feeling or also thinking, their perspectives and emotions. For example, when communicating with a partner, you might want to adjust your speech depending on who you're talking to, right? If the other person is not really good at English or in Korean, you might want to slow down your pace. You might want to use easy vocabulary. We make those changes depending on this idea of what this person is going through. You would not talk to me as you would not say the same thing to me compared to when you're talking to a child, 5-year-old, for example, right? You would definitely change the way, the tone, for example, the language itself, all these would change because you have empathy. Okay, so empathy is trying to understand the situation from the other person's point of view. That's how you would be able to understand what empathy refers to. So this brings us to individual differences in personality now. So I think a lot of you are familiar with this idea or acronym of E and I these days. I think a lot of kids or MZ generation are, not no longer using this to begin with, but they might express themselves by saying like, I'm an E type or I'm an I type. The idea related to E and I is a little bit different here. When we are talking about extroversion, it refers to this tendency to seek interaction and also external validation. So you get support or validation from outside. That's what extroversion refers to. So it refers to how a person has a very deep-seated need to receive ego enhancement, self-esteem, and a sense of wholesome or wholeness from others. This is the most important part. So you get your self-confidence not by yourself, but you get it from other people's compliments, for example. So that's what extroversion refers to. Introversion, however, refers to this tendency again to rely more on the internal reflection. So to which a person derives a sense of wholeness or fulfillment from within, rather than from external affirmation by others. So for an introversion person, you might not get influenced much by what other people say. You might care less because you get your affirmation by yourself. So that's the essential differences between what extroversion and introversion here refers to. However, both traits in extroversion and introversion can influence language learning in different ways. For example, extroverted learners, as we just talked about, would like to get feedback from other people, right, on who you are. But at the same time, they might therefore be more engaged in speaking activities. But the introversion person, you get more of a learning done by reflecting on your own learning. For example, keeping journals, writing, right? Writing a blog, for example. So doing something yourself, reflecting, that's where you get the power from. But the extroverted person usually gets the power from outside. So that's the essential difference between the two. So what might be potential weakness of extroverted learners in language learning contexts? Or I think the question should be both extroverted or introverted to the extreme end.
I think weakness of extroverted person is too conscious about the
Yeah.
feedback or response from others.
You're absolutely right. A person who is too extroverted gets a lot of feedback or relies on the feedback of others, right? And that way it's very fragile sometimes. Like it's fine if you get good compliments, good feedback from others, but once you're being criticized, it might just make your day horrible, right? So like when we're talking about the extroversion or extroverted people, to an extreme end. That might be some of the weaknesses that they possess. But in addition to that, in contrast, the introverted person, what do you think a person who is too introverted, what do you think might happen? Or what do you think might be some of the weaknesses in language learning?
I think not being able to practice the language with people because you prefer to keep it to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, we talked about social interaction essentially being involved in language learning, right? So if the social interaction is not only happening in online setting, then you might still have limited access to the maintenance of your relationship with other people or language development. So you can't really practice with the tone or the sound, right? So those might be missing when we are talking about the lack of social or speaking interaction. Good. I think you have a good understanding of, I think a lot of you guys have a better understanding of personality nowadays than I do. But so moving now to something that you might find more familiar. So this idea of personality traits was out, and this was again, I think we have to talk about the Korean setting a while ago. Long time ago when I used to go to school, we used to I think it's almost like human instinct that we want to categorize things, right? In order to organize things into categories. When I used to go to school, we were so obsessed with blood types. Does anyone know what? So we even had a movie called Blood Type B Boyfriend or something like that. So we were that obsessed. And what it did was it was trying to tell what kind of person you are. So if you had a blood type A, you are somewhat timid or it's more related to like introverted characteristics, I believe. If you have B, A, B, and O, you have all these personality traits. Surprisingly, this was what I found out was that this was only popular in two countries, including Korea and Japan. In other countries, so when I went to Canada, I found that nobody was paying attention to blood type anymore. They were paying attention to horoscopes. So when you were born, so they were talking about like what kind of like let's say you're Gemini, then you are this type of person. So I think it's somewhat related to our human instinct that we want to categorize people into groups. And another one just came in, and this was hanging along quite a while in language learning or in general understanding of human into characteristics. Again, so it started off with how many horoscopes do we have?
So,
12, right? Okay. 12, and we also have the years and the animal years, right? Anyways, so it started off with 4 to 12, and then now we have 16. So this one again was trying to put people into category describing more easily about what kind of person you are. What do you think might be some of the challenges in using this type of 16 types in describing a person's personality? Or have you guys all taken this? Do you guys all know? Oh, okay. Well, so what did you guys think? What were your experience? Do you think this is like a Bible? Or what do you think?
It's hard to explain someone in between.
Oh, in between. Interesting. What do you mean by in between?
Many people say, I'm half ear, half eye.
Oh, so nowadays people are describing themselves as half and half. That's very interesting. Anything else? You know, I've never taken this, by the way, and I heard that because I do studies, I do research on identity construction, and I don't believe in this. So when people ask me, what are you? I'm like, I didn't take it. And I actually heard that there's actually a category for people who do not take it. And I thought that was so funny. Like you categorize even the people who decide to not take it. So there are these peculiar, strange weirdos over here. And that was me. So I was like, oh, okay, that's funny. But I think it's interesting how people have started to identify that there are these shifting or somewhat of an overlap, right? What do you think that signal, or what do you think that suggests in terms of like how people understand their own identity or their own personality? When you say 50-50, what do you think that means? Yeah.
There's like a gradational
Mhm.
of it. It's not really divided. It's you can have both extrovert and introvert kind of I guess characteristics,
Mhm.
but you can't just divide it. It's gradational.
I think that's interesting how people have started. I think that you're onto a point where we say that our personality traits somewhat change, right? Depending on, again, the situation or who you're with, right? Sometimes you might feel like I am generally an introvert person, but I usually am very extroverted when I'm talking to my best friend or with my family, right? So I think we change in a way to describe when we are talking about personality. This is just another side note. I have a very close friend who is a year younger than me, and she is very kind. Like to me, she's like very, very kind. And I introduced her to another friend of mine who's also female, by the way. They're all female. So I told her like she's very, very kind. She never gets mad, you know, like so she's perfect. So like, you know, let's be all friends. So the other friend of mine, I think she's a person who kind of knows what the other person is like very easily. You know, there are these people who can easily get what the other persons are like. So she was interacting with her for like a few seconds or a few minutes. And she said that, oh, you must be very mean to your boyfriend. And I was like, what? No, she's so lovely. Like she never gets mad. And this girl, let's say her English name was Jenny. So she was like, how did you know? I was like, what? What? And so the assumption that she made was that if you are being too nice to everyone, there actually needs to be some sort of an exit where you have to get your real self out. And that usually comes out when you're with somebody who's very close. So that was her theory. But to me, that was very interesting about how this person has this identity of a very kind, lovely person. But to her boyfriend, she has a completely different identity, right? So I think that goes along with our understanding of our shifting understanding or the gradual changes that we make in terms of our personality types. I have a question too, or I think I talked about myself enough, but do you guys think I'm more of an E person or an I person?
Only in when you are with.
Did you remember? I already gave you the spoiler. Yes, people often assume that I'm an Eve person, but you'll be surprised that during my conference presentation, when I go to a conference, I get overwhelmed by people that I usually want to stay at like hotel and then go to only the presentations that I'm interested in. So I'm really not really good at networking. I would have to say that it's very surprising because I use a lot of gestures. So people assume that I'm a very extroverted person, but that's not really the case. Anyway, so I think that we've, however, changed. We were talking about presentation, right? I hated giving presentation when I was at your age too. But then once you are exposed to it, or once you have to do it anyways, then you kind of develop your presentation skills along that you can guide yourself in certain ways. So anyways, enough talk about me. So the personality types again, it was again being criticized. Why do you think it was challenged or criticized? You can't find any criticism for this perfect 16 boxes. I think all the criticism has to do with that you can't put people into 16 categories. There are much more people, human beings out there. So that's one of them. And also looking at, I think in this class, we started talking about how there are 50-50 balance or how there are changes. But initially, when it came out, it was more received as something that is fixed. And a lot of criticism has to do with that. Okay, so let's quickly go over motivation now. I think we talked about I think we all know the definition of motivation, right? What motivation means, but how would motivation be understood in behavioral approaches? So going back to our lecture 1, we talked about behavioral, cognitive approaches, and constructivist approaches. How do you think that motivation will be understood from the behavioral approaches? Do you guys remember in behavioral approaches, we do something physical, do an action, and you receive a carrot or a reward, right? So in the behavior approaches, this idea of motivation will be received with reward. Okay, so that becomes the reward. Motivation becomes the reward. How about cognitive approaches? Cognitive approaches, we talked about that was more related to mental, right? So it has to do more with the goals and expectations of the learners. So that will be the cognitive approaches which focus on goals and expectations. The final constructivist approach emphasized, does anyone remember? Social, right? Good. Social context and also the personal meaning attached to it. So how we look at motivation would also change depending on which approach you take, right? So let's try to look at the 2 common types of motivation, which is the first one, intrinsic motivation, and the other one, extrinsic motivation. As you can tell from the wording itself, intrinsic, something that happens within. Extrinsic, that happens outside. So intrinsic motivation refers to choices made and effort expended on activities for which there is no apparent external reward. What this means is there is nothing that you are going to get out of as an external reward by learning English, for example, except the satisfaction. So you get something inside. Extrinsic motivation refers to engaging in an activity for external rewards. For example, a learner who studies English because this person enjoys it might be referring to the intrinsic motivation. But if you are doing it just to get a good test score, that will be extrinsic motivation. If your parents tell you like, I'll buy you something once you get a perfect on this, that's extrinsic motivation. So both types are important, but they often lead to different learning experiences. Which one do you think will be stronger? It depends on how big the extrinsic reward is. It depends on the learner too, right? So we can't never say that intrinsic motivation is always the strongest one, but it usually is somewhat, it lasts longer usually compared to extrinsic motivation. So then some of the other social psychological perspectives include a lot of different orientation. The first one is called instrumental orientation, which refers to learning a language as a means of achieving practical goals, such as obtaining a degree or certificate, advancing a career, reading technical materials, or engaging in translation. We also have integrative orientation, which refers to the learning of a language in order to integrate into the culture or a second language community and participate in social interaction within that group, which is socially or culturally oriented with the purposes. So regarding instrumental and integrative orientation, you might experience, let's say we have a student who's going to go study abroad, right? This student, if the student is trying to learn the language just for instrumental purposes, that student might experience a lot of, let's say, culture shock, for example, right? Because that person is not intending to get immersed in the setting. However, if the person has more of an integrative orientation that you want to sing along the song or learn the culture from their point of view, then in those cases, the integrative orientation would work better. Moving on to the next one, motivation intensity is another keyword that comes out, which refers to the strength of an individual's motivational drive or the learner's effort. It refers to the strength. How strong is it to learn or continue learning? Learning is not always pink and rosy, right? It's not always happy moments or happy discovery. You can always feel failure. You can always feel very frustrated when you're talking or writing or whatever you're doing in the learning process. However, if you have a strong motivational intensity, then it means that you can go through the whole process whenever there are these challenges that confront you. On the other hand, demotivation is another term that comes up to refer to the loss of interest or motivation that was once present. This loss may result from either external or internal factors. Demotivation is a very somewhat sad, right, in a way, because you had motivation, but you just lost it. It does not refer to having no motivation from the very beginning. It means that you have to have it one time and then lose it. That's what demotivation is. However, amotivation in the self-determination theory, it refers to the complete absence of motivation, typically resulting from feelings of incompetence and helplessness. So there is no motivation at all. So demotivation refers to the loss of it, and the final state of having no interest, that's referred to as amotivation. So the next one has to do with social dynamic and constructivist approaches. This perspective emphasizes the role of the brain that we talked about before, the neurobiology, and also emotions in language learning. Overall, positive emotional evaluations would support learning, right? And while negative evaluations can hinder or impede in the process. So when we talk about the neurobiology of affect, the emotion, is that there is no more basic mechanism for language acquisition than the brain. So John Schumann's work concluded that positive appraisals of language learning situation enhances language learning and negative appraisals inhibit second language learning. So if you could keep getting negative evaluations, then you might, in fact, or anyone would lose interest and say like, I am not good at this. There's no use in continuing this learning. So that's related to the brain, how the brain is also connected in the emotion of the learners. Moving on to the next item, sustained deep learning. Sustained deep learning requires long-term engagement and also value-based motivation. Here, this one refers to the kind of learning that requires an extended period of time to achieve goals. So sustained means continuing, right? So that's what sustained deep learning refers to, which is rooted in the biological concept of value. So value is a bias that leads humans to certain preferences and to choosing among alternative. So when we this wording itself might sound a little bit difficult, but try to think about the first question I asked you initially, like when you choose a foreign language, which language do you choose? We think about the value of the language. Which one is going to be more valuable to me in the long run or right now, right? So that has to do with understanding the concept of value and a person who finds personal learning, personal meaning in the learning are more likely to continue learning over time. So that's related to this idea of sustained deep learning. Ow, my voice hurts and it's cracking now. Okay. There's something wrong with the slide here. Does not look pretty, but anyway, there's a lot big space here. I do need to change that. So going back to the measurement of affective factors, we talked about some of the ideas, including the foreign language anxiety scale or the WTC, for example. These are just a number of questionnaire that is out there to measure these affective factors that we have. Affective factors, however, overall are very difficult to measure. Why do you think it's difficult to measure affective factors?
subjective.
Too subjective? What do you mean by being too subjective? Your feeling is too subjective, or your understanding of your feeling is too subjective?
Only I can answer.
Ah, only I can understand how I really feel, right? Okay. Anyone else?
And sometimes I don't even know how I feel.
Yeah. Sometimes it's very difficult to describe or to really understand where you're coming from, right? How you feel. Yeah, I think that's another one. Anything else?
Sometimes I tend to check how I want to be, not how I am.
Yes. You know that actually I heard that some of the way that you verbalize your feelings might affect how you actually feel. So I think that's another interesting point that you might in fact say like keep almost like a spell, like you say like it's gonna be fine. I'm gonna be fine. I feel good, right? Another interesting point related to that was that you know how you have butterflies in your stomach when you're very, let's say, nervous, like when you're giving presentation. My academic advisor, in fact, told me that because I remember before going for a conference presentation or something, I was like, oh, I'm having butterflies and I'm worried. And she said that, you know, the feeling that we get, I think you can think about yourself too. When you're worried or when you're nervous, the feeling is the same as when you are very excited. Does, can you it took me a while to really get it or absorb it. But let's say that you have like a very exciting date or concert that you're going to go to. And then the feeling that you have, the feeling itself is pretty much the same, but how we attach the negative connotations to it, like nervous or excited, is pretty much very different depending on the wording itself. So that always stuck with me. So what she told me was, whenever I feel worried, tell to yourself, I'm so excited. And I was like, really, before going to conference presentation, not really, but yeah, I'm very excited. So yeah, when we talk about the feeling, but in addition to that, we put our feelings into words, right? And do you really think that my level of excited is the same level of excitement? Let's say when you say I'm excited, do you think it's the same? It could be the same. It could be, but it could not be too. But we use the same language to describe the feeling, right? But the degree of that, in fact, would be very different depending on the standard that you have or the bar that you have on your excitement. Like you have to be super excited to say, acknowledge that I am excited. Or you can be slightly excited and say, like, oh, I'm so excited, right? So I think it also depends on the person who's answering. So I think that is why, one of the reasons why it's quite difficult to measure these affective factors. So a lot of the times we have these self-checks. The WTC and also the Foreign Language and Classroom Anxiety Scale also is self-report surveys, right? So these self-report surveys are commonly used, but they have their own limitations. So as you just talked about, the subjectivity, right? The learners might not respond objectively, and also some of the cultural differences might in fact affect their interpretation and also the responses. So measurement methods, including the in-thought tests, are reliable but expensive and require a highly trained expert to administer them. And while self-check, paper pencil tests have a number of inherent assessment problems, they have remained a standard for applied linguistic research today. So the ones that you have seen so far. But these self-check tests have drawbacks, as we just went through them. The problem of validity is paramount, since most tests use a self-rating method, which may lack objectivity. Also, you might guise yourself in the responses, as we just talked about. Another one is called self-flattery syndrome, that test takers will try to discern answers that make them look good or that do not damage them, even though test directions say there are no right or wrong answers. This is similar to MBTI, I believe. When you're answering questions, you kind of, can understand, okay, I think this question is asking me about this type of personal traits, then you might want to answer in a way that will give you the answer that you want. So that's related to this idea of self-flattery. Another one, test of extroversion, anxiety, motivation, and other factors can be quite culturally ethnocentric, using concepts and references that are difficult to interpret cross-culturally. What do you think this means? The last one, when we're talking about the cross-cultural difficulties in measuring extroversion, anxiety, motivation, and such.
I think the lifestyle and experience very different from another country.
You're absolutely right, right? So try to think about your own elementary school classroom. How many, or did you find a lot of students raising hands when they want to talk in front of other groups? You don't remember your elementary school years now? Okay. But as what we just talked about, related to some of these ideas related to like motivation or extroversion, introversion, all sorts, it might in fact depend on culture. That's one of the reasons why this measuring the affective factors might be, most of them came from the US context. So therefore, these questions might in fact be influenced by the culture itself. There was an interesting study long time ago which measured how people interviewed, for example. So this candidate was from India, and this person was very talented. So this person had the skill. However, when they were doing the interview, or when I give you guys compliments, I think you can kind of resonate here. When I give you guys compliments, a lot of the Korean students also go like, oh, no, no, no. Why no? Right? But a lot of people say, 아니, 아니에요, right? And then this kind of attitude, like we are expected to be somewhat modest. So this Indian candidate went for a job interview, and it was like some sort of an experiment, and was behaving in the way that he thought was appropriate from his own culture. So when he was being praised of his research or his past experience, he kept on saying like, "Oh no, it's nothing, nothing," right? And then afterwards, they ask the interviewers about the capability of this person. And then surprisingly, or not surprisingly, that he did not really get a good score compared to his actual ability. So what's expected from this Western interviewers were that why was he shying, or why was he being too shy to lower, or to, in fact, in a way, misrepresent himself, right? So what that particular research was pointing out was that there are these cultural items that come into our interaction. And also when we're talking about emotion, how to express emotion. Some cultures you can freely express, or expressing your anger is fine. But in some cultures, that might be understood as being barbaric somewhat. So I think expressing these affective factors would also be dependent on the culture or the community, or where this type of measurement was being established. So those are some of the ideas that I want you to take away with this week. And start thinking, I mean, you can go back to your MBTI, start questioning whether this is actually right or wrong, or look at it from a time, like let's say retaking these exam after a while might in fact tell you quite a lot about yourself as well. So it's interesting tools that people can in fact use. Okay, so for this week, I'm going to stop here. I have to tell you guys something that you might find something like this tagging along. Please disregard it. Don't use it or don't answer it. The journal is going to come next week, so this is not supposed to be there. And also, please disregard the last 2 pages. So no last 2 pages. Okay, so I think that's about it for today. If you have any questions or anything that you want to talk to me about, please stay and ask me before you leave. Yes. And your midterm exams, the scores are going to come along probably by the end of this week.